maybe you could talk a little bit, also introduce yourself, about gender disparity in the IT industry, how that's changed over the years, if at all, and how these gender relations have shaped women's experiences in IT and diverse work settings. Does that sound like a good place to start?
Yeah, thank you, Tola. Good afternoon, everyone. A little bit about me. I've got such a complex background and CV, I hardly know how to describe myself. Since the early 80s, I've been very interested in and concerned by the gender inequalities in computing professions, partly as a result of having observed the rollout of computers in the first workplaces in the early 80s and the disparities of skill and opportunity that went alongside that. The early 80s, and still it seems to me that nothing very much has changed substantially. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. I have a sort of mixed academic policy background, so I've worked in a selection of universities, including, it seems, almost everyone else in this room, Edinburgh University. And I've also worked in the European Commission and in NGOs, and my working life wound up in a university in Spain, where I ran, under the auspices of Manuel Castells, a research centre on gender and information technology. While I was in Spain, I got drawn into a EU cost action on virtual work. And virtual work was described, and we understood it at that time as being, and I quote, labour, whether paid or unpaid, that is carried out using a combination of digital and telecommunications technologies and/or produces content for digital media. And I give you that definition now because what I want to do in this talk is to broaden our discussions a bit away from simply thinking about what we conventionally think of as being IT work into a much broader set of content production activities. And I think once we start to do that, the disparities and the various diversity dimensions of these types of work become much clearer. So that's what I was working on up until a few years ago, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. While I was in Barcelona, we were looking at the differences in women's participation in various broadly defined IT professions across different EU countries and drawing on lessons from elsewhere in the world. What was particularly striking to us was the enduring absence of women in IT. So in preparation of this talk, I kind of went back through my own personal archive, which I don't know what to do with either. I pulled out a few papers that are sitting in a box file somewhere. This was a DTI strategy for women in science, engineering and technology, dated 2003. This is the Institute of Physics Guide to Best Practice in Career Break Management, designed to attract women in scientific and technical professions. Then there was the UKRC Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology, which existed in the mid-2000s, early 2010s. This fact sheet is from 2010, and it quotes the statistic that only 14.4% of computing professionals are female. The latest stats that I've laid my hands on are Eurostat statistics, which across Europe show a figure of something like 17%. So the representation of women in these areas of work has crept up, but some of these policy documents are now really rather old. As I've been alive, I'm old enough and ugly enough to remember policy initiatives going back to the early 80s, and really, we're still at less than 1 in 5. So why? When I was in Spain doing work there, we identified several points in a woman's life course at which they left the professions altogether, and that seems to me to be still relevant. The 2 points that seem to be critical were maternity and mid-career. Maternity, because a lot of the work was so hostile to people trying to balance several different demands on them that women left in their droves if they were Anstelar, the key people within families responsible for child rearing. Mid-career, what we were seeing was those women who came back into the profession and into this area of work, leaving again because they were sandwiched between two types of care. And it's still the case that women form the majority of carers. So caring for elderly and caring for children at the same time. And so what you had was women coming into the profession, sometimes being encouraged by special public policy measures, by company initiatives and so on, coming in, studying, and then dropping out at maternity, a cohort perhaps re-entering or staying in, and then dropping out again in mid-career. And it seems to me that that dynamic still holds. I haven't seen any evidence that suggests that those two leaking points have changed very much. And I pick up policy documents still that say very much the same kind of thing. I also did a quick web search just to sort of see whether or not the tech industry has got any more female friendly since the days when I started looking at this. And I just printed out the results of a web search, and it's quite shocking really. Here are the top results, headlines. Harassment in the tech industry from Project When. Why women are being driven out of the technology industry. That's the World Economic Forum 2023. 7 ways to close tech's corrosive gender gap. That's Fortune 2021. Gender gap in the tech industry, Deloitte, and on and on. Amazon will investigate gender discrimination. Tesla, sexual harassment. Tech workers explain what drove them out of the industry, and on and on and on. So what we have is a mixture of hostile working conditions and hostile culture, and that remains the case. So we've got this kind of chilly climate. I think that explains what's happening in conventionally defined tech professions. I became very interested then in what's happening within digital work now. And by digital work, I mean that vast variety of professions, including media, content production and other things. And within the cost action that I was involved with, we were finding that digital labour had a certain set of features that, again, were not only disadvantageous to social groups such as women, but also exhibited a set of characteristics which meant the disadvantage was actually being spread throughout the workforce. So what started as a sort of set of working conditions that exhibited gender disparities, I think became disadvantageous to all. And I give you several examples. First of all, a lot of digital labour is done at a distance, by which I mean that it can be outsourced globally, and often is, or it's performed locally, but online and not in a workplace. And both of those developments are harmful, I think, to good pay, decent pay, because often outsourcing means workers competing with one another globally in global labour markets where they do not know what they're competing against in terms of pay. The growth of online work, I think, atomises and individualises workers. It means that people are working much, much longer hours than they ever used to. Work is encroaching into their private time, and that has huge implications, again, for people who are balancing domestic labour and paid labour, unpaid labour and paid labour. So what we find, I think, is that in a number of digital professions, and I'm thinking here of things like content production, vlogging, moderating, all sorts of newly emerging occupations that you can't really call computer science in the traditional sense of the word. Those are marked by precarity, by insecurity, often by low pay, and significantly by a very poor representation within the trade union movement. It's very hard to organise people who are working separately and independently in different homes or dispersed workplaces. So we're seeing a very great growth in individualisation in the workforce. And I think what that means is there's a whole set of structural disadvantages that are emerging in digital work. And they're structural, but they're being treated as though they're individual. So we more and more see working people trying to find individualised solutions for what is essentially a structural set of circumstances. the campaigning group Plan B has written something like, "We're all very stressed now," referring to, and I think we can all ourselves identify with that sentiment. The idea of having the phone under the pillow, the idea of checking your emails any time of the day or night, the idea of work encroaching into your private time and space. It's true of us all. It's particularly true when you have to engage online in order to earn the next crust. We're seeing a growth in a workforce that is scraping together its living from various different sources in order to stay alive. And I think so that kind of disadvantage that was once true of women's work is now increasingly true of all work.
Thank you, Juliet. Wow.